Why are they on the increase? I guess there's two reasons for that. One is the general upward trend in the amount that companies are outsourcing at the moment. It just makes good business sense to outsource more in a lot of cases. And the other side of that is what attackers are doing. So this is nothing new. Attackers are always going to go after the weakest link, the low-hanging fruit. And it just so happens that in a lot of cases, that is a supplier rather than you as your own organization. And I guess the reason that poses such a challenge to most organizations is that your suppliers are not within your direct control. And there's a lot of kind of human invented barriers between doing something with that. So there's anti-competition you've got to worry about. There's legal contractual obligations there, which means it seems much easier to look at your own security and how to control what's within inside your perimeter than it is to look at a supplier's security. So generally, the challenges with the way people are doing TPRM today is that it's seen as this governance, tick box, compliance exercise. It's there to be able to demonstrate that you're doing effective assurance, rather than looking at it as an overall objective to reduce your security risk. It means that people don't see it as something that's really helpful and useful. It's just something they really need to get done, which creates a kind of despondence, a disillusionment in the process. And it creates this vicious cycle where, because that people see it that way, they don't put as much effort into it, and it means that it becomes less and less useful. So we need to break free from that vicious cycle and look at it in a slightly different way to be able to make it more effective and reduce the challenges we currently are seeing with it. So we need to start seeing this as a more of an operational challenge rather than a governance exercise. Involve your SecOps teams in it. Talk to your threat intel teams if you have them, or your external providers. This kind of data on where our suppliers are is incredibly useful for responding to attacks in an operational way. It's just that generally it's split between the governance team and the ops team, which is not a helpful way to look at this. It needs to be an open collaboration with your suppliers. We need to understand and acknowledge the fact that actually we're all working towards the same goal here. We're all trying to make sure that every single organization has a baseline level of security. So no one organization can be such a weak link that become an entry point for everybody else. The way in which we need to do this is to open those communication channels with our suppliers early on. Make sure you're not approaching it in a kind of audit assurance test kind of a way. So that puts your suppliers on the back foot. It incentivizes them to perhaps not be as forthcoming with their information, especially when we're talking about security weaknesses. You are their customer. They don't want to tell you where perhaps their weak points are because they're trying to win a contract with you. But what that means is that you don't get an accurate view of what their security is like. You can't help them to improve those weaknesses. And as doing that, you are then improving the security of the entire ecosystem. So it's creating those communication channels, creating a really good relationship with your suppliers right from the beginning of that, so that when something happens, you've got that relationship, you've got those communication channels, and you can work collaboratively to improve the security, to respond in an effective way and reduce the impact of that incident as much as you can. So the way we're looking at this is, we explain we've got TPRM is seen as a governance exercise, and then you've got your SecOps, which is responding to incidents. What do you do when the response is supposed to be a supply chain incident? Is it your GRC team that are trying to have the relationship with the supplier, or is it your SecOps team that are doing the incident response? The way in which this needs to happen is you need to view your TPRM, your third-party risk management, your supplier assurance, whatever you want to call it, as a way in which to build up the database, build up the connections, build up your extended network diagrams to understand your ecosystem better so that when something happens, you can respond much better. So for example, every time you go through a supplier assurance review, you onboard a new supplier, that shouldn't be a one-off exercise that is just something you need to get through. It's a once and done. It should be something that by going through that exercise, you are adding it to your database, you're gathering information, and you're creating those communication channels. And it means like when something happens, whether there's an incident at that supplier in particular, or whether it's a more industry-wide incident, a critical vulnerability that's identified, something like the MoveIt vulnerabilities or Log4j, it means that you can much, much easier have a very quick conversation with that supplier, can perhaps gather data using some kind of tool or system that means you don't have to go through that manual communication with your supplier. which increases your response speed. We want to make sure that you're effectively leveraging any TPRM activities you're doing. Don't waste any time that you're putting into your supplier assurance reviews. Make sure that's useful for you now and in the future when it comes to supply chain incidents. So I think we're learning as an industry that when something happens, when there's a security incident, the collaboration between organizations, whether that's within a sector or whether that's across geographies or just generally collaboration on responding to an incident is becoming more and more important. I think I saw a change happen when SolarWinds happened a few years ago. And we noticed that this was not going to be solved by one organization alone. If you look at the response and the detection, and we learned about the SolarWinds incident, there were multiple organizations in that chain. And it was only through collating their data that they had, collating that information, we could really piece together the pathway that the attackers had taken there. And that's what's going to need to happen, especially as we have so much more collaboration, outsourcing happening. It has to be working together, finding ways to get over those anti-competition barriers, get over the legal barriers, and just realize that we are all in it together and we all need to work together to defend against attacks that happen.